What if the darkest decade of a leader's life wasn't a downfall, but the secret furnace where greatness was forged? This is the untold story of Winston Churchill. At the age of 60, Winston Churchill found himself in the political wilderness. After a career that had seen him in the thick of some of the most significant moments of British history, he was no longer a central figure in the government. In fact, for nearly a decade, Churchill would be dismissed, mocked, and politically sidelined. In this period, known as the wilderness years, his influence appeared at an all-time low. But while others saw Churchill's isolation as a time of irrelevance, the truth is that it was a time of quiet preparation. Far from a failure, the wilderness years were the crucible in which Churchill's greatness was forged, the very furnace that would burn away his flaws, build his resilience, and transform him into the leader Britain would one day need. In this video, we'll take a deep dive into those years of obscurity, examining how a leader at the height of disfavor used his time to craft his legacy, hone his psyche, and prepare for a future moment of destiny. This is the untold story of Winston Churchill's wilderness years, where failure was transformed into triumph, and a leader rose from the ashes of political exile to lead a nation through its darkest hours. Winston Churchill's name is synonymous with courage, leadership, and the fight for freedom. But how did a man who was once politically sidelined, mocked by his contemporaries, and cast aside by his own party, become the legendary figure we know today? The answer lies in his wilderness years, a period of over a decade when Churchill, far from the political limelight, prepared for a leadership role that would change the course of history. This video will explore those wilderness years, focusing not just on the events that shaped them, but on the psychological journey Churchill underwent during this time. How did he endure isolation, failure, and the sting of public ridicule? How did he transform these challenges into a foundation for future greatness? By examining the psychological resilience, creative output, and quiet determination Churchill cultivated in these years, we will uncover the true nature of leadership, how it is forged not in the light of success, but in the crucible of failure and uncertainty. This is the story of Winston Churchill's wilderness years, where the greatest leader Britain would ever know found his strength and his calling. Winston Churchill's wilderness years didn't begin with the typical fall from grace. His political career, from his early days as a brilliant orator and First Lord of the Admiralty during World War I, had been marked by highs and lows, victories and humiliations. However, nothing prepared him for the devastation of the Gallipoli campaign during World War I. Churchill's career took a dramatic downturn after the failure of Gallipoli in 1915. As the architect of the ill-fated operation, he was widely blamed for its disastrous outcome. The campaign, intended to secure the Dardanelles and weaken the Ottoman Empire, ended in catastrophic failure. Thousands of lives were lost, and Churchill, as the man who had pushed for the offensive, was forced to resign from his position. The political fallout was immediate and brutal. He was publicly humiliated, and his political career seemed all but over. But the isolation Churchill would experience in the years that followed went beyond mere political disgrace. His political colleagues turned their backs on him, and the public lost faith in his leadership. As a result, Churchill found himself on the periphery of British politics for a significant portion of the 1920s and early 1930s. Gone were the headlines, the parliamentary debates, and the prominence he had once enjoyed. For the first time in his life, Churchill was a political outsider. Psychologically, this was a devastating blow. Churchill, who had always thrived in the public eye, now found himself with little to no influence. Yet, despite the humiliation, he did not fall into despair. Instead, Churchill faced what can only be described as a psychological turning point. For the first time, he was forced to confront himself, his weaknesses, and his demons. This period of political isolation, though painful, would prove to be a defining one for his personal development. It is during these wilderness years that Churchill would begin to cultivate the resilience and determination that would later define his leadership during World War II. He learned how to adapt to rejection, how to channel his frustration into productive outlets, and how to redefine himself as a figure of intellectual and artistic depth. An outsider in politics, but a force in his own right. Amidst the isolation and political banishment, Churchill found an unlikely sanctuary: creativity. Far from retreating into bitterness, Churchill threw himself into work, using the void left by political rejection to explore new forms of expression. If the political world had turned its back on him, Churchill would create his own stage, not in the halls of Westminster, but through words, art, and history. During the 1920s and 1930s, Churchill penned over 11 books and wrote more than 400 articles. His literary output was extraordinary, an escape from his political limbo, but also a means of rebuilding his sense of self-worth. He wrote histories, memoirs, and reflections on his personal and political experiences, which, even though many were not immediately recognized for their brilliance, would later form the foundation of his legacy as a statesman and a scholar. Among his most notable works during this period were his multi-volume histories of World War I, his biography of his ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough, and his reflections on politics and leadership. Writing, in essence, became his battleground. He used the pages of his books to fight his inner demons, expressing the ideals and convictions that were so central to his identity. His writing also served as a way to process his personal pain and disillusionment, transforming those emotions into something that could outlive him, something historical. In addition to his prolific writing, Churchill took up painting as another outlet for his emotions. Although not a renowned artist, he found in painting a way to express his inner world. For a man known for his fiery speeches and bold political moves, painting provided a much-needed contrast, a quiet, meditative process in which he could pour his frustrations, desires, and hopes onto the canvas. His paintings were a way to work through the depression he often battled, a therapeutic activity that allowed him to escape into a realm of color and form while grappling with his darkest thoughts. His creative output during this time is striking, not just for its volume, but for its purpose. Every book written, every article published, every painting completed was an act of defiance against the psychological isolation he endured. It was his way of proving to himself and to the world that he was not defeated, that the fire of his ambition was still burning brightly, even if it was smoldering in the background. What makes this period of creative productivity so fascinating is the fact that Churchill did not wait for external validation. He did not wait for political success or a public re-embrace to begin his work. Instead, he used his solitude to expand his intellectual and artistic horizons. The lesson here is clear. Creativity in isolation can be an act of inner rebellion, a way to maintain one's sense of purpose and identity when the world around you seems indifferent or hostile. In psychology, this can be understood as the use of what we call constructive isolation. Instead of succumbing to loneliness and despair, Churchill found ways to use his isolation as an incubator for growth. He was not simply marking time. He was preparing himself for a future moment of relevance, even if that future seemed distant and uncertain. His creativity provided him with the mental and emotional tools needed to survive and eventually thrive in the years to come. This period of intense productivity, though often overlooked in discussions of Churchill's life, is in many ways where the seeds of his wartime leadership were sown. His ability to generate work and meaning in the face of rejection was a direct manifestation of his psychological resilience. Rather than waiting for the world to affirm him, Churchill decided to create his own affirmation through his work. He was, in essence, using his solitude to master the art of self-motivation and creative perseverance. Winston Churchill's wilderness years were not merely a time of solitude and creativity. They were also a time of intense self-definition. From this period emerged one of the most striking elements of Churchill's persona, the outsider. During the 1930s, while Britain's political establishment focused on appeasement and diplomatic negotiations with Nazi Germany, Churchill stood almost alone in his warnings against the growing threat of fascism. His refusal to conform to the dominant political currents of the time marked him as a figure of controversy, but it also set the stage for his rise to prominence. To understand Churchill's outsider status, it's essential to consider the psychology of nonconformity. In psychology, nonconformity often emerges as a powerful response to societal pressures, a way of asserting individuality in the face of groupthink. For Churchill, the political establishment had become mired in complacency, convinced that Nazi Germany could be pacified through diplomacy and concessions. Churchill, however, saw the truth long before the rest of Britain did. He understood that the Nazi regime posed an existential threat, not just to Britain, but to the entire world. His insistence on confronting Hitler, on arming Britain, and on opposing appeasement was met with ridicule, mockery, and isolation. He was called an alarmist, a warmonger, even a madman. Yet, he remained steadfast, convinced that history would eventually vindicate him. To Churchill, this wasn't just a matter of political difference, it was a matter of survival. And while his views may have been dismissed in the 1930s, they would eventually prove to be prophetic. The psychology of this outsider position is fascinating. It's easy to imagine how difficult it must have been for Churchill to continue advocating for war, while the majority of his peers in the British government were focused on diplomacy. His sense of conviction, his unshakable belief that he was right, and his willingness to stand apart from the crowd demonstrated a deep psychological resilience. Churchill's nonconformity wasn't rooted in ego or a desire for attention. Rather, it was a manifestation of his deep moral clarity. He was not driven by a need to be right in the eyes of others. He was driven by a need to do what he believed was necessary to protect Britain and the world. His belief in the righteousness of his cause gave him the courage to stand alone, even when that meant going against his party, his peers, and the prevailing political tide. This psychological stance of being an outsider also mirrors the experiences of many modern innovators and changemakers. Think about entrepreneurs, artists, or activists who, in their time, were seen as eccentric or out of step with society. Their ideas were often dismissed as unrealistic or even dangerous. Yet, in hindsight, many of these figures are celebrated as visionaries because they saw the world not as it was, but as it could be. Churchill, in many ways, was a pioneer in this regard. His willingness to embrace nonconformity, to think beyond the accepted wisdom of his time, gave him an edge that would later prove to be essential during the darkest days of World War II. The psychological takeaway from Churchill's experience as an outsider is clear. Sometimes, the greatest truths are those that the majority refuses to acknowledge. It requires a certain kind of mental fortitude to hold to your beliefs when the world around you is telling you that you are wrong. This kind of conviction is not arrogance. It is the ability to see through the noise and maintain clarity in the face of uncertainty. Churchill's outsider status was not a barrier to his leadership. It was, in fact, the very thing that set him apart as the leader Britain needed. Throughout his wilderness years, Churchill was not only grappling with political exclusion and the sense of being a prophet ignored by the masses, he was also fighting a deeply personal battle with depression. Churchill often referred to this period of his life as being haunted by his black dog, a metaphor he used to describe the overwhelming periods of sadness and despair that periodically consumed him. For Churchill, the black dog wasn't just an occasional melancholic mood. It was a near-constant companion, one that threatened to drain him of his energy, creativity, and purpose. Yet, despite the toll that depression took on him, Churchill did not allow it to define him. In fact, he found ways to harness the very thing that seemed to pull him under. This is where we begin to see the psychological strength that Churchill developed during his wilderness years. He didn't let the black dog take away his ability to act. Instead, he learned to manage his depression in ways that allowed him to continue working, creating, and preparing for the eventual return to the political spotlight. A key element in Churchill's coping mechanism during this time was his use of alcohol. Though it is often regarded as a negative influence, Churchill's relationship with whiskey was more nuanced. He didn't use it to escape his troubles, but rather as a tool for managing his inner turmoil and maintaining his mental focus. It was, in a sense, a form of self-medication, a psychological crutch that enabled him to push through the emotional weight he carried. Churchill himself famously claimed, "I have taken more out of alcohol than alcohol has taken out of me." For him, whiskey was a stabilizing force, one that allowed him to maintain his energy, his wit, and his mental sharpness. Psychologically, this reveals an interesting dynamic. Alcohol, in Churchill's case, wasn't used purely as a means of escape. He didn't withdraw into drunkenness. Instead, he maintained a disciplined relationship with it. While alcohol undoubtedly played a part in numbing some of his pain, it also acted as a catalyst for his creativity, allowing him to remain productive and focused during a time of emotional darkness. He used it strategically to lift his mood just enough to allow him to write, think, and work, tools necessary for maintaining his sense of identity and purpose in an otherwise bleak period of his life. Yet, while Churchill's use of alcohol helped him manage his depression, it also speaks to a deeper psychological truth about his character, his resilience. The reality of depression is that it can often feel like an insurmountable barrier to productivity. But Churchill's ability to continue working, even while battling the black dog, shows us that resilience isn't about never experiencing despair. It's about learning how to function in spite of it. His creative productivity, despite his internal struggles, is a testament to his extraordinary psychological fortitude. In modern psychology, we often talk about functional depression, where individuals continue to operate and fulfill their responsibilities even while suffering from emotional distress. This is what we see in Churchill, someone who, despite being deeply affected by his mental health challenges, was still able to accomplish remarkable feats. His struggle with depression was not an obstacle that stopped him. Rather, it was something he learned to live with and navigate as he continued to pursue his goals. One could argue that Churchill's ability to use his depression and his relationship with alcohol as tools for resilience mirrors the broader lessons we can all take from adversity. Life's most challenging moments often come with deep psychological scars. But those scars, if we allow ourselves to process and learn from them, can also be the very thing that makes us stronger, more creative, and more adaptable. Churchill's ability to face his internal struggles with dignity and perseverance, while still producing world-changing work, reminds us that we too can continue moving forward, even in our darkest moments. Even in the midst of political exile and personal struggle, Winston Churchill remained acutely aware of the power of narrative. One of the most striking features of his wilderness years was his ability to actively shape his own story. In many ways, Churchill was not merely waiting for his political moment to arrive, he was preparing for it by crafting his legend. Churchill's ability to direct his own image was not a superficial or self-indulgent endeavor. It was a deliberate, calculated strategy. He understood that, even in the absence of political power, the way he framed his past, his values, and his convictions could position him for a future role as the leader Britain would one day need. Churchill spent much of his time during the 1920s and 1930s writing biographies, including his monumental work on his ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough. By reinterpreting the past, Churchill was not simply documenting history, he was shaping the way the public, and perhaps future generations, would view his legacy. Writing about the Duke of Marlborough was, for Churchill, more than an academic exercise. It was a way of reflecting on his own life, seeing himself in the context of history, and preparing for his future role as a statesman. He often drew parallels between Marlborough's leadership during the wars of the early 18th century and his own potential to guide Britain through future crises. By writing about past figures, Churchill was rehearsing his own future greatness, positioning himself as a historian, a visionary, and a leader who understood the importance of long-term strategy. His speeches, too, were part of this grand, self-directed role. Churchill was a master of rhetoric, and during his time in the political wilderness, he continued to hone his speaking skills. He understood the value of narrative in leadership, how the right words, spoken at the right moment, could inspire nations, create movements, and shift the course of history. His speeches were not just reactions to current events, they were rehearsals for the future. When Churchill delivered his iconic wartime speeches, they were not just spontaneous outpourings of emotion, they were the culmination of years of preparation, both in terms of content and delivery. This psychological awareness of his role in history gives us valuable insights into the nature of leadership. Churchill recognized that true leadership is not just about seizing opportunities when they arise, it's about preparing for those opportunities even when they seemed distant or unlikely. His sense of personal narrative, his active role in directing his own legend, was not vanity, it was strategy. In the wilderness years, he wasn't simply biding his time. He was actively crafting the narrative of his life so that when the moment came, he would be ready to step into the role that history had waiting for him. This focus on narrative is something we can all apply to our own lives. The way we view our past, frame our present, and imagine our future shapes the way we experience the world and the opportunities that come our way. If Churchill's wilderness years teach us anything, it's that leadership is as much about vision as it is about action. By crafting a clear narrative, one that connects our past experiences to our future aspirations, we can actively shape our path, even in times of obscurity or uncertainty. Churchill was not simply a passive participant in his own story. He was the author, the director, and the lead actor, and he understood the importance of framing the story he wanted to tell. In moments of solitude, when the world had turned its back on him, he was already preparing for his triumphant return to the political stage. While Churchill's political exile, creative output, and self-directed narrative all played pivotal roles in his preparation for future leadership, there is another crucial element of his wilderness years that cannot be overlooked: his ability to learn from failure. In fact, one of the greatest psychological lessons Churchill gained from his wilderness years was how to turn failure into a powerful tool for growth. Let's return to the Gallipoli campaign, a defining failure in Churchill's career. Though he would go on to lead Britain through World War II, Gallipoli remained a source of deep personal regret for Churchill. At the time, it appeared to be a monumental blunder, one that cost the lives of thousands and irreparably damaged his political career. But rather than allowing this failure to consume him, Churchill used it as a catalyst for personal and professional transformation. Psychologically speaking, failure can either break a person or build them. In Churchill's case, Gallipoli was a moment of profound humility, one that forced him to reassess his approach to leadership, decision-making, and strategy. After the failure, he spent years reflecting on what went wrong, studying the intricacies of military leadership, and refining his ability to make complex decisions under pressure. Rather than clinging to his earlier arrogance, Churchill's post-Gallipoli self-reflection made him more cautious, more measured, and more attuned to the nuances of leadership. This process of learning from failure is something we can all benefit from. In psychology, there is a concept known as post-traumatic growth, where individuals use failure, setbacks, or trauma as a springboard for personal development. Churchill's post-Gallipoli period is a textbook example of this. He didn't see failure as the end of his political career. He saw it as an opportunity to learn, adapt, and improve. This is a critical psychological shift, to move from seeing failure as an insurmountable obstacle to viewing it as an essential part of the journey towards success. By embracing failure and allowing it to shape him, Churchill developed the resilience, humility, and wisdom that would make him an effective leader during World War II. His ability to reflect on his mistakes, to learn from them, and to grow in response to adversity was in many ways his secret weapon. Even more importantly, Churchill's journey with failure teaches us that leadership is not just about avoiding mistakes. It's about how we respond when they inevitably occur. In the wilderness years, Churchill demonstrated that the true measure of a leader is not the absence of failure, but the ability to turn failure into an instrument of growth and future success. This ability to learn from his past missteps became one of Churchill's most powerful traits, and it is what ultimately enabled him to lead Britain to victory in the Second World War. Winston Churchill's wilderness years, though deeply personal and centered on his own path to future greatness, also offer profound, universal lessons for all of us. These lessons transcend politics and history, speaking directly to the challenges we face as individuals in moments of hardship, failure, and solitude. From his resilience and self-awareness to his unshakable conviction, Churchill's experience in the wilderness offers a blueprint for overcoming adversity and preparing for the inevitable moments of crisis in our own lives. Perhaps the most significant lesson Churchill's journey teaches us is the power of resilience in the face of adversity. Churchill's ability to persist through years of political marginalization, personal setbacks, and public ridicule is nothing short of extraordinary. In a world that often values instant success and rapid results, Churchill reminds us that resilience is not about avoiding failure. It's about how we respond when things don't go as planned. In psychology, resilience is often defined as the capacity to bounce back from setbacks. It's the ability to endure hardship without losing hope, to continue moving forward even when the path seems unclear. Churchill embodied this trait to its fullest extent. Even in his darkest moments, he did not succumb to despair. He embraced the process of learning and growth, finding ways to convert each setback into a stepping stone toward greater success. His story reminds us that, no matter how bleak the present moment may seem, it is always possible to rise again, stronger and more prepared for what lies ahead. Another crucial lesson from Churchill's wilderness years is the importance of self-belief and conviction. Despite being out of favor with his peers, Churchill never wavered in his belief that he was right about the dangers posed by Nazi Germany. His refusal to conform to the prevailing political consensus of the time is a powerful example of the value of staying true to one's convictions, even when they are unpopular or misunderstood. His unwavering belief in his own vision of the world enabled him to persevere when others doubted him. It was this conviction that ultimately allowed him to rise to the occasion when the world needed him most. However, Churchill's story also highlights the importance of humility in leadership. His post-Gallipoli reflection shows that even the greatest leaders must learn to confront their own failures and weaknesses. Churchill's ability to accept and learn from his mistakes, particularly his failure in Gallipoli, allowed him to grow as a leader and make wiser decisions in the future. True leadership, as Churchill's life demonstrates, is not about being infallible. It's about learning, evolving, and growing from experiences of failure. Moreover, Churchill's ability to embrace solitude during his wilderness years was a key component of his psychological development. We often view isolation as a negative force, one that leads to loneliness and despair. Yet, for Churchill, it became a space for creative expression, intellectual growth, and self-reflection. In solitude, he found the freedom to explore his thoughts, write, paint, and develop his ideas away from the pressures of public life. His example encourages us to view isolation not as a time of stagnation, but as an opportunity to cultivate new skills, discover new passions, and engage in deep self-reflection. Ultimately, Churchill's journey through the wilderness years teaches us that even in the darkest, most uncertain periods of our lives, there is immense potential for growth and transformation. His story is a powerful reminder that leadership is not about being in the spotlight or having all the answers. It's about developing the resilience, conviction, and humility to face challenges head-on and preparing ourselves for the moment when we are called upon to lead. We can take inspiration from Churchill's ability to see potential in adversity. His wilderness years were not wasted time. They were the necessary foundation for the triumphs that would come later. The psychological lessons from this period, resilience, humility, creativity, and unwavering conviction, are applicable not only to leaders, but to anyone facing obstacles in their own lives. By following Churchill's example, we too can use the crucible of adversity to shape ourselves into the individuals we are meant to become. While Winston Churchill's story is an inspiring narrative of personal and professional transformation, the real power of his journey lies in how we can apply his lessons to our own lives. Just as Churchill used his wilderness years to prepare for the moment when he would lead Britain through its darkest hour, we can use our own periods of solitude, failure, and hardship to shape our future. One of the most effective strategies is to create what we can call a wilderness journal. This journal would not simply be a record of thoughts or a place to vent frustrations, but a tool for critical reflection and creative exploration. Just as Churchill turned his isolation into a time of prolific writing and artistic creation, we too can use solitude to foster personal growth. Start by reflecting on your current situation. Are there areas in your life where you feel sidelined or disconnected? Rather than seeing this as a disadvantage, view it as an opportunity to sharpen your thinking and creativity. Use your wilderness journal to explore new ideas, to write about your dreams, and to map out plans that may seem unconventional. The wilderness doesn't have to be a period of stagnation. It can be a space for growth and discovery, where ideas are allowed to germinate away from the pressures of external expectations. Churchill also turned to his creative outlets, writing and painting, as ways to process his feelings and express his ideas. You may not be a writer or artist, but there are other creative ways to engage with your own thoughts. Whether through journaling, drawing, music, or any form of creative expression, these activities allow us to channel our inner struggles into something productive. When life feels overwhelming, creativity becomes a powerful psychological tool for reclaiming control over our emotions and building clarity in the midst of confusion. Another essential lesson from Churchill's experience is the importance of developing resilience during times of failure. He didn't shy away from failure or attempt to ignore his mistakes. Instead, he used them as stepping stones for his future success. This is a powerful mindset shift we can all adopt. Rather than seeing failure as a sign of weakness or an obstacle to progress, we can view it as an opportunity for growth. Start by reflecting on your past failures and asking yourself, what did I learn from this? How can I use this experience to become stronger and wiser moving forward? In addition, Churchill's unwavering conviction and sense of self-belief were central to his success. Even when the world was against him, he remained steadfast in his vision. We can learn from this by practicing self-belief and resilience in our own lives. When faced with adversity, it's important to ask ourselves, what do I believe in? And how can I hold on to that belief even when circumstances are difficult? This doesn't mean stubbornly refusing to adapt, but rather maintaining an inner strength and clarity of purpose that allows us to stay true to our values, even when the external world seems chaotic or hostile. Finally, like Churchill, we must learn to embrace solitude and use it as a time for self-reflection and growth. In today's world, we are often surrounded by distractions and external pressures, making it hard to find time for introspection. However, solitude can be a powerful catalyst for personal transformation. Whether you take time for quiet reflection, journaling, or simply being present with your thoughts, this practice can help you gain clarity on your goals, dreams, and values. Embrace moments of solitude as opportunities for growth rather than as experiences of isolation or loneliness. In sum, Churchill's wilderness years offer us a powerful reminder that adversity and isolation can be transformative forces in our lives. By using periods of hardship to reflect, learn, and grow, we can create the foundation for future success. Just as Churchill emerged from the wilderness to lead Britain through its most critical moment, we too can emerge from our own personal wilderness with renewed strength, wisdom, and clarity. The key is to view these challenges not as roadblocks, but as opportunities to shape ourselves into the individuals we are meant to become. As we reflect on Winston Churchill's wilderness years, there are deeper psychological complexities worth exploring. While his resilience, creativity, and self-belief are undoubtedly admirable qualities, there are nuances to his character and journey that invite further consideration. These subtleties touch on the balance between ambition and ego, the dual role failure plays in both humbling and strengthening a leader, and how one navigates the psychological territory between stubbornness and conviction. Churchill's story is, at its core, one of relentless ambition, a drive to achieve greatness, to influence history, and to leave a lasting legacy. But the line between ambition and ego is often thin, and Churchill's life offers a profound case study in how ambition can sometimes be blurred by the desire for recognition and personal validation. Churchill's early career was marked by his ambitious drive to rise through the ranks of British politics. His sharp intellect, fiery speeches, and bold initiatives were impressive, but they also fed his desire for prominence and success. In the aftermath of Gallipoli, Churchill was forced to reckon with the consequences of his ambitious nature. His political career, at that time, was seen as irreparably damaged by his failure, and the resulting public humiliation challenged him to reassess his motivations. Psychologically speaking, Churchill's ego, much like that of any driven individual, was bruised by his fall from grace. His ambition had propelled him to the heights of political power, but it also left him vulnerable to the crushing effects of failure. It is in the wilderness years, however, that Churchill began to gain a deeper understanding of the relationship between his ambition and his ego. Rather than retreating into bitterness or seeking to protect his ego, Churchill used this period of exile to recalibrate his understanding of leadership. He recognized that his drive for success had to be tempered by humility, and he began to embrace the idea that leadership was not about personal glory, but about service and sacrifice. This shift in mindset is key for anyone striving for success. It's not enough to simply desire achievement. One must also be willing to learn from failure, adapt, and serve a greater purpose than oneself. Churchill's wilderness years were not just about maintaining his sense of self-importance. They were about learning to lead with authenticity and humility. It was this refined ambition, free of the excessive ego that once dominated his character, that would later serve him in his greatest leadership role during World War II. One of the most striking aspects of Churchill's journey through his wilderness years is how he transformed his greatest failure into an instrument of growth. The Gallipoli campaign, which would haunt him for much of his life, was the crucible through which Churchill learned humility. Before Gallipoli, Churchill was a man of immense confidence, often bordering on arrogance. His self-assurance was a double-edged sword, allowing him to take bold risks, but also leading to overconfidence in his strategic thinking. The psychological impact of failure, especially one as public and costly as Gallipoli, is profound. For many, failure becomes a permanent wound, a scar that shapes their future decisions and self-worth. For Churchill, however, failure became a powerful learning tool. It forced him to confront his flaws head-on, reassess his decision-making process, and develop a deeper understanding of leadership. This is where the concept of post-traumatic growth comes into play. In the aftermath of Gallipoli, Churchill did not allow his failure to define him negatively. Instead, he reframed it as an opportunity for personal evolution. His resilience allowed him to learn from his mistakes without being consumed by shame or regret. By embracing his failures as part of his broader journey, Churchill emerged from the wilderness not only wiser, but also more capable of handling the immense responsibilities that lay ahead. Another psychological challenge Churchill faced was distinguishing between stubbornness and true conviction. The same fierce resolve that helped him stand against the prevailing political currents in the 1930s also led him to be perceived as inflexible or obstinate. While his refusal to accept appeasement and his insistence on preparing Britain for war were ultimately justified, Churchill's unwavering stance was not always understood in the moment. The distinction between stubbornness and conviction is subtle but crucial. Stubbornness is often driven by ego and a desire to be right, while conviction is rooted in a deep moral or intellectual belief. Churchill's refusal to conform to popular opinion during the interwar period was not merely a matter of defiance. It was grounded in his conviction that Britain needed to confront fascism head-on before it was too late. However, there were moments when Churchill's determination bordered on stubbornness. In some instances, he pushed his ideas so forcefully that it alienated potential allies and caused unnecessary conflict. But through his time in the wilderness, he refined his ability to listen, to assess situations with greater humility, and to adjust his tactics when necessary. In this way, Churchill learned to differentiate between righteous conviction and the more dangerous, ego-driven stubbornness that can alienate others and hinder progress. For those of us navigating our own professional and personal journeys, this distinction is critical. Conviction provides us with the clarity and resilience to pursue our goals, even when they seem unpopular or impossible. But without self-awareness, that same conviction can devolve into stubbornness, leading us to overlook feedback, dismiss alternative perspectives, or stubbornly pursue a path that is no longer serving us. Churchill's wilderness years are a masterclass in balancing conviction with the flexibility required for effective leadership. Winston Churchill's wilderness years offer us a profound insight into the true nature of leadership and personal growth. Far from being a time of failure, obscurity, and irrelevance, this period of Churchill's life was the crucial foundation upon which his future greatness was built. It was a time of deep psychological work, where he confronted his flaws, learned from failure, cultivated creativity, and refined his sense of purpose. His story teaches us that leadership is not born from constant success, but is forged in adversity, humility, and the willingness to learn and grow. Churchill's time in the wilderness demonstrates that great leaders are often shaped not by the moments of glory, but by the quiet and solitary periods when they are forced to confront their own weaknesses, make sense of failure, and prepare for future challenges. Leadership is not just about responding to the crises when they arise. It's about spending time preparing, developing resilience, nurturing creativity, and honing conviction during the years of obscurity. As we reflect on Churchill's wilderness years, we see that the true mark of leadership is psychological fortitude, the ability to face setbacks, failures, and solitude with grace, creativity, and unwavering purpose. By embracing adversity, learning from our failures, and crafting our own narrative, we too can build the psychological strength necessary to lead in times of crisis. Churchill's story reminds us that greatness often arises not when we are at our best, but when we are tested the most. The wilderness, therefore, is not a place of defeat. It is a crucible in which character is tested, resilience is built, and future leadership potential is nurtured. Churchill's wilderness years show us that even in our darkest times, we have the power to transform ourselves, to refine our sense of purpose, and to emerge ready for whatever challenges lie ahead. What do you see clearly that the world ignores? How can you turn it into a silent weapon, much like Churchill did during his wilderness years? The next time you face adversity, isolation, or failure, remember that it is not a setback, but an opportunity to sharpen your mind, refine your goals, and prepare for the moment when your leadership will be called upon. Start creating your own wilderness journal, a place to reflect, create, and envision the future you want to build. Use solitude as a tool to sharpen your critical thinking, explore new ideas, and prepare for challenges ahead. Embrace the quiet moments of your own wilderness as the birthplace of your future greatness. Winston Churchill's wilderness years are an inspiring testament to the power of resilience, self-belief, and the transformation that can arise from failure. His journey teaches us that leadership is not a destination but a process, one that requires patience, humility, and a deep understanding of our own psychological strength. The true essence of leadership is forged in times of struggle, and through Churchill's example, we see that even in isolation, greatness is possible. Thank you for watching. Remember, the wilderness is not the end. It is just the beginning of your greatest transformation.